The flight attendant barely glanced at the woman as she boarded the plane. Dressed in an elegant yet understated outfit, the woman carried herself with quiet confidence. But to the flight attendant, she was just another passenger, one who didn't belong in first class. She didn't acknowledge her. Didn't offer the usual warm greeting. Instead, her eyes flickered with a hint of irritation as the woman placed her designer handbag in the overhead bin and took her seat near the window. The flight was nearly full. Businessmen in expensive suits were sipping their pre-departure drinks, some already typing on laptops, while others leaned back, immersed in their own world. But the moment this woman sat down, the energy shifted. The flight attendant, poised, with years of experience, stiffened. Something about the woman bothered her. She approached briskly, a forced smile barely concealing her skepticism. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Her tone wasn't friendly. It was the kind of question that suggested the woman was somehow out of place, as if she had wandered into a restricted area by mistake. The woman barely looked up. "Yes, I'm sure." But the flight attendant wasn't convinced. She waited, expecting an apology or an explanation. None came. The woman simply adjusted her seatbelt. Passengers nearby exchanged glances. Some shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. The flight attendant wasn't finished. She reached for the woman's boarding pass, eyes scanning it quickly. Her brows twitched. "First class. Seat confirmed." A flicker of something, confusion, disbelief, crossed her face. She hesitated, but then scoffed lightly. "Well, all right then," she said, handing the boarding pass back with a dismissive wave. The woman accepted it without a word, her expression unreadable. The flight attendant turned sharply on her heels, muttering under her breath as she walked away. "This is going to be an interesting flight." Tension builds. Minutes passed, but the discomfort lingered. The woman sat perfectly still, her posture relaxed yet commanding. The flight attendant, however, wasn't done making her presence known. She deliberately served every other first-class passenger first, offering them champagne, warm towels, and an effortless smile. But when she reached the woman's seat, she paused, then turned away, without a word. No drink. No warm towel. No menu offering the gourmet meal options. Nothing. A businessman across the aisle noticed. He frowned, watching as the woman remained still, her fingers lightly tapping the armrest. The flight attendant breezed past again. This time, the businessman spoke up. "Excuse me, I think you forgot someone." The flight attendant's lips pressed into a tight line. "She hasn't requested anything," she replied smoothly, eyes darting to the woman's seat. The woman smiled, but there was something knowing behind it. The businessman sighed, shaking his head. "You're really not going to serve her, are you?" The flight attendant's fake smile returned. "I have a job to do, sir." The businessman exhaled, clearly unimpressed. He turned back to his newspaper, but his interest in the flight had suddenly shifted. Other passengers started noticing too. Whispers spread. Yet, the woman still said nothing. She sat there, calm. Observing. Waiting. And then, as the plane doors closed and the final announcements were made, she did something unexpected. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. The call was brief. A few hushed words, then silence. But the way she spoke, the quiet authority, the absolute certainty in her voice, sent a shiver down the flight attendant's spine. For the first time since boarding, the woman looked up, directly at her. And that was when the flight attendant felt it. A strange, sinking feeling in her chest. Something wasn't right. She had assumed this woman was just another passenger. She had assumed she had no power. But as the engines roared to life and the plane lifted off the ground, she was about to realize, too late, just how wrong she was. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane ascended, breaking through thick clouds. Passengers settled in, some reading, others sipping drinks or adjusting their seats. But for the flight attendant, things felt different. Something about the way the woman had looked at her before takeoff, it stayed with her. A quiet, unsettling confidence. She brushed it off. It was nothing. Still, as she moved through the aisle, checking on passengers, she couldn't help but glance back at the woman. There she was, calmly seated, eyes focused on the screen in front of her. She wasn't angry. Wasn't flustered. That was the problem. People who get mistreated usually react, they argue, demand to speak to a manager, cause a scene. But this woman? She just waited. The flight attendant swallowed, adjusting her uniform. She needed to move on. The power play begins. Not long after, the flight attendants began their first-class service. The woman was still ignored. Drinks were poured, trays of gourmet food placed before passengers, except her. She said nothing. But the whispers had started to spread. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances, noticing the deliberate neglect. One of them, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, sighed and pressed the call button. The flight attendant arrived with a forced smile. "Yes, sir." "The lady hasn't been served yet," he said, nodding toward the woman. "I think she was skipped." The flight attendant's stomach tightened. Why was everyone suddenly noticing? "I'll take care of it," she replied quickly, turning away. But she didn't move. Instead, she stood there, staring at the woman. Waiting. Waiting for her to demand service. To ask for something. The woman simply sat perfectly still, as if she already knew what was coming. After another long pause, the flight attendant walked away. The murmurs grew louder. But the woman? She picked up her phone again. She dialed a number. Spoke a few words. This time, the supervisor noticed. He frowned, glancing at his tablet. A second later, a message flashed across his screen. Something from corporate. His eyes widened. He stood abruptly, his expression tightening as he walked toward the front of the cabin. Something is wrong. The flight attendant continued with her duties, pretending not to hear the whispers, pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't. She felt a strange weight in the air. Like the entire cabin was waiting for something to happen. Then. Ding. A notification appeared on her own work tablet. Urgent, contact cockpit immediately. Her heart skipped. She swiped the message away. It had to be a mistake. The woman wasn't anyone important, just a random passenger with a first-class ticket. Right? Another ding. A second message. This one was worse. Do not ignore this message. CEO on board. Her breath caught. The letters burned into her brain. CEO? Her CEO? No. No, that wasn't possible. This was a joke. A mistake. She turned slowly, eyes locking onto the woman again. For the first time, she noticed the subtle details. The way her posture commanded space. The way her presence seemed to shift the entire mood of the cabin. The way the flight supervisor had vanished to make a call. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't happening. The woman wasn't just anyone. She had disrespected someone powerful. And she was about to realize, too late, just how much she had messed up. The flight attendant's breath hitched as the realization sank in. Her mind raced. CEO on board. There was no way this could be true. It had to be a mistake. Her fingers trembled as she subtly glanced at the woman, still seated, still eerily calm. The woman was watching her now, not in anger, not in frustration. But with expectation. As if she knew exactly when the pieces would start falling into place. And they were. The flight supervisor, who had vanished minutes ago, reappeared suddenly. His expression was different now. Stiff. Uncomfortable. He marched straight toward the flight attendant. Passengers noticed. The whispers grew louder. She clenched her hands into fists, trying to hold on to her composure. Then. Come with me. His voice was clipped. No explanation. No warmth. Just a direct order. She hesitated. Sir, I have a job to do. Now. Something about the way he said it made her stomach drop. This wasn't a routine conversation. Something serious was happening. Without another word, she followed him toward the service area at the front of the plane, stepping behind the privacy curtain. Passengers tried to catch a glimpse, sensing the tension. The door to the cockpit was slightly open. The captain's voice, usually calm and controlled, sounded tense. She couldn't hear everything, but one sentence stood out. Did she really think she could get away with it? Her pulse pounded. The flight supervisor turned to face her, arms crossed. Then he handed her his tablet. She barely glanced at it before her stomach twisted into a knot. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a joke. It was her. The woman she had treated like she was nothing. Was the highest-ranking person in the airline. Her direct boss. The one person who had the power to end her career with a single call. Her mouth went dry. The supervisor's expression was unreadable. Explain. Her lips parted. No words came out. Because there was nothing to explain. She had messed up. Badly. Meanwhile, back in first class. The woman calmly sipped her drink. She had not asked for an apology. She had not demanded special treatment. And yet, the entire plane now revolved around her. Every eye in first class was on her. Some passengers had figured it out. Others were still in the dark, watching in fascination as a simple flight took a very unexpected turn. The businessman who had spoken up earlier leaned over. You knew this was going to happen, didn't you? He asked in a low voice. The woman smiled, but her eyes didn't waver. People always reveal who they are when they think no one important is watching, she replied. The businessman exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That's cold. Her smile widened. That's business. Another passenger, an elderly man across the aisle, adjusted his glasses, his expression thoughtful. So, what happens now? The woman set her drink down. That depends on her. And just like that, she turned her gaze toward the privacy curtain. Where the flight attendant was about to face a decision that could change her life forever. The flight attendant's hands felt cold as she stared at the tablet screen. The woman she had disrespected, ignored, and humiliated, was the CEO of the airline. Her mind reeled. How? Why hadn't she recognized her? The flight supervisor's voice cut through her panic. You understand what this means, don't you? She swallowed hard, but no words came out. The supervisor's face was unreadable, but there was no sympathy in his eyes. Only disappointment. She hasn't made a complaint. Yet, he added, watching her reaction. But corporate already knows. The captain knows. The entire crew is aware of what's happening. His voice lowered. The passengers have noticed too. The flight attendant clenched her fists. She wanted to deny it, to defend herself, say she hadn't done anything wrong. But she knew. She knew exactly what she had done. She had assumed. She had let her bias dictate how she treated someone who didn't fit her expectations of a first-class passenger. And now? Now, her entire career was hanging by a thread. The walk of shame. Go back out there, the supervisor ordered. And fix this. The flight attendant's heart pounded as she stepped out from behind the curtain. The moment she reappeared, the entire first-class cabin fell silent. Every pair of eyes followed her as she walked, stiff, hesitant, toward the woman's seat. The CEO hadn't moved. She was still sitting there, perfectly composed, waiting. The flight attendant's throat felt tight as she stopped beside her. Passengers leaned in, watching. She forced a breath. "Ma'am, I apologize for earlier," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should not have treated you that way." The woman slowly looked up at her. "Which part?" The flight attendant blinked. The woman's gaze was steady, calm, but sharp. "Which part are you apologizing for?" she repeated. The flight attendant's mouth went dry. She could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze pressing down on her. There was no escape. She had to say it. She had to admit it. A deep breath. "I assumed you didn't belong here." There. The words were out in the open, hanging in the air between them. For the first time since the flight began, the CEO's expression shifted. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just quiet understanding. The unexpected twist. The CEO studied the flight attendant for a moment. Then, instead of responding, she reached for her phone. One tap. A message sent. Seconds later, the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest on board today. Please join me in welcoming our airline CEO, who has decided to fly with us unannounced." A stunned silence. Then, whispers exploded across the cabin. Passengers turned to stare at the CEO, then at the flight attendant. A few people even clapped. The flight attendant felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her. There was no hiding from this now. She had just been exposed, not just to the crew, but to every single person on this plane. And the worst part? The CEO still hadn't said what she was going to do next. A thick silence hung in the first-class cabin. The flight attendant's face burned with humiliation. Passengers whispered in hushed voices, glancing between her and the CEO. Some wore expressions of shock, others of curiosity, waiting to see what would happen next. The CEO had said nothing yet. She sat, calm as ever, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had apologized. But was it enough? Would she be fired on the spot? Would security be waiting for her as soon as the plane landed? Her mind spun with worst-case scenarios. The CEO finally sighed, setting her drink down. She looked up at the flight attendant, not with anger, but something deeper. Something unsettling. "Tell me something," the CEO said, voice smooth but firm. "If I weren't who I am, would you still be standing here apologizing?" The question hit like a punch to the chest. The flight attendant felt her breath catch. Passengers leaned in. The CEO tilted her head, watching closely. "If I had been just another passenger," she continued, her tone deceptively casual, "would you have regretted how you treated me? Or are you only sorry because you got caught?" The flight attendant's throat closed up. What could she say? Because the truth was, she knew the answer. She had dismissed the woman because of an assumption. Had she been some wealthy businessman in a tailored suit, she would have greeted him with a smile. Had she been a blonde socialite dripping in diamonds, she would have poured her champagne without hesitation. But she had looked at this woman, a black woman, dressed elegantly but not flashy, and decided she didn't belong. Her silence was an answer in itself. A murmur rippled through the cabin. The CEO sighed again, but this time, there was a slight smile, a knowing one. "That's what I thought." The flight attendant's heart dropped. She was done. This was it. She braced herself for the final blow, the termination, the punishment, the end of her career. But what the CEO said next shocked everyone. "Sit down." The flight attendant blinked. "Ma'am?" The CEO gestured to the empty seat beside her. "Sit. We need to talk." Passengers gasped. The flight attendant hesitated. This wasn't what she had expected. A public shaming? Yes. Immediate termination? Maybe. But, this? Her legs felt weak as she lowered herself into the seat. The CEO folded her hands in her lap. Her expression was thoughtful now, rather than harsh. She didn't want revenge. She wanted something far more powerful. A lesson. The flight attendant sat frozen in the seat next to the CEO, her body stiff with uncertainty. Passengers watched in silence, the tension in the air palpable. The CEO's gaze never wavered from the flight attendant, her eyes sharp and calculated. For a moment, she said nothing. She simply studied her, as if weighing something far beyond the situation in front of her. The flight attendant's heart raced, and she couldn't escape the feeling that her entire career was on the line. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the CEO spoke, softly, but with undeniable authority. "I'm not here to punish you," she said, her voice steady and controlled. The flight attendant blinked in confusion. "You're not?" "No," the CEO replied, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "What I'm going to do is far more important than simply firing you. Because I've seen this before." The flight attendant felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She wanted to protest, tell the CEO she was sorry, that she would do anything to make it right. But she remained silent, unsure of what was about to come next. "You didn't see me for who I am," the CEO continued. "You saw me for what you assumed I was. And you judged me based on that. But I want you to understand something." The woman paused, her gaze now softer, more thoughtful. "This isn't just about you and me. It's about a culture that lets bias and assumptions govern how we treat each other." The flight attendant could feel her cheeks redden. It wasn't just her career on the line. It was her entire understanding of what it meant to treat others with respect. The CEO leaned forward slightly, as though she was about to share a secret, a truth that would change everything. "I'm going to give you a choice," the CEO said, her voice unwavering. "You can leave this airline right now, walk off this plane, and never look back. Or you can stay and prove to me, and to yourself, that you can be better than your assumptions." The words hit her like a tidal wave. She could leave. It would be easier. The shame of being fired, the fear of facing the consequences, it could all end. She could walk away from this uncomfortable moment. But something about the CEO's tone, the quiet challenge in her eyes, made her hesitate. The flight attendant wasn't sure what was being asked of her. "How can I prove anything after what I've done?" she asked quietly. The CEO met her gaze, her expression no longer hard, but understanding. "You'll prove it with actions, not words," she said. "You'll prove it by owning your mistake. By taking responsibility for it and not hiding from it." For the first time, the flight attendant felt a shift inside her. She had assumed that doing the right thing meant apologizing and getting punished. She had assumed that the world was a place where mistakes were dealt with harshly, without mercy. But the woman sitting beside her, the one she had so wrongly judged, was showing her a different kind of power. The power of growth. The power of redemption. The flight attendant swallowed, her voice now steady. "I'll stay." The CEO smiled. It was small, but there was something almost approving in her eyes. "Good. Now, let's get back to work." A change in the air. The next few hours felt strangely different for the flight attendant. She moved through the aisles, serving drinks and meals, but there was a new sense of purpose in her actions. Every smile she offered, every polite word she spoke, carried a weight she hadn't realized before. She didn't just see her job as a task anymore, it was a chance to make things right. The passengers seemed to notice the change, too. Some smiled at her more openly, others gave her a nod of approval, as though they could sense something different in her demeanor. But none of that mattered as much as the lesson that had settled into her chest. She had been given a second chance, not just by the CEO, but by the world itself. And she wasn't going to waste it. As the plane neared its destination, the CEO stood up from her seat, preparing to leave. She didn't make a grand exit. There were no cameras, no reporters. She simply walked toward the front of the plane, heading toward the cabin door. The flight attendant followed her, a respectful distance behind, her heart swelling with gratitude. As the CEO reached the door, she turned back for a final word. "Thank you for staying." Then, she was gone. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, reflecting on what had just happened. What had she learned? To never judge others based on assumptions. To never underestimate the power of change. The flight attendant's mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. She had gone from being the object of shame and humiliation to someone who had been given a chance to prove she could be better. And now, as the plane touched down, the weight of her decision hit her all over again. Stay or leave. It was more than just a professional decision. It was a personal one. When the plane finally landed and the seatbelt sign turned off, the flight attendant took a moment to compose herself. "I have to make it right," she whispered to herself. The phone call. As soon as the plane emptied, she went straight to the back office. Her hands shook as she sat down in front of the phone. She had the number. The number she never thought she would need. It was the CEO's personal line, the same one she had used on the flight. She hesitated. Would the woman even remember her? Would she still have time for someone like her? She dialed. The phone rang once. Then twice. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was familiar, calm, and confident. Her heart skipped. It was her. The CEO. "Ma'am, it's me." There was a pause. Then, the CEO spoke, her tone welcoming, as though she had been expecting this call. "I thought you might call. What's on your mind?" The flight attendant felt a mix of nervousness and resolve as she explained everything. How she had decided to stay. How she had reflected on the mistake she had made, and how she wanted to prove she could do better. There was no judgment in the CEO's voice, only understanding. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. "It's easy to walk away from something difficult. It takes real strength to face it and fix it." The flight attendant's eyes welled up, but she stayed focused. She couldn't let this opportunity slip by. "Thank you for the chance," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't let you down." The CEO smiled on the other end of the line. "I believe you. Let's see what you can do from here." A new beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The flight attendant started training for a new position, one that would require her to take on more responsibility, to lead, to train others, and to set an example. The CEO had been serious. She hadn't just given her a chance to stay, she had given her the opportunity to prove herself. And she wasn't going to waste it. As the flight attendant walked through the halls of the airport, she no longer carried the weight of shame. Instead, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that every action she took would define who she was becoming. The transformation. Months passed. The flight attendant had grown. She learned from her mistakes, took the lessons to heart, and began leading with respect, not just for others, but for herself. She learned how to embrace her flaws and turn them into strengths. She understood the true meaning of empathy, to recognize that everyone, regardless of their appearance, had a story, a struggle, and a place in the world. One day, while walking through the airport, she spotted a familiar face, the CEO. The woman's eyes caught hers, and a knowing smile crossed her face. "I see the change," she said, her tone approving. "You've come a long way." The flight attendant smiled back. "I wouldn't be here without you." The CEO simply nodded, a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. "You've learned the most important lesson. People aren't defined by what others think of them, but by how they treat others, and themselves." The flight attendant knew this was just the beginning of something greater. The days following the CEO's visit seemed to stretch endlessly. As the flight attendant embraced her new responsibilities, there was a lingering sense of change in the air. Every interaction, every decision she made, carried the weight of that lesson she had learned. She didn't have the luxury of fading into the background anymore. She was now expected to lead by example. Not just as a flight attendant, but as someone who had been given a chance to rewrite her story. And, deep down, she was determined to do just that. The incident that changed everything. It wasn't long before her transformation was put to the ultimate test. One late evening, a flight was preparing to take off when a disturbance occurred in first class. A young woman, clearly upset, stood at the front of the cabin, shouting at the flight attendants. Her luggage had been lost, and her tone grew more aggressive with each passing second. The flight attendants, unsure of how to de-escalate the situation, exchanged worried glances. The woman's anger was quickly becoming a spectacle, and passengers were starting to notice. The flight attendant knew what she had to do. She took a deep breath, remembering the lesson she had learned. This wasn't about the customer being right or wrong. It was about treating the situation with respect, with empathy, and with professionalism. She stepped forward, her movements calm and deliberate. She walked straight toward the woman, her posture firm but composed. "Ma'am, I can see you're upset," she said in a clear, soothing tone. "Let's take a moment to figure this out. I promise you, we'll do everything we can to make it right." The woman's anger flickered, but the flight attendant didn't give in. She didn't react defensively, didn't become frustrated. She simply offered her a solution, a way forward. It wasn't long before the woman calmed down, her shoulders relaxing. Passengers, who had been watching in silence, now whispered among themselves. They had seen the same flight attendant who had once been caught up in assumptions, now acting with calm authority. A growing reputation. In the weeks that followed, the flight attendant's reputation began to grow. She had proven herself time and time again in these small moments, not by making grand gestures, but by showing respect to every person she encountered, regardless of their social status or attitude. The CEO had been right when she said this wasn't just about one moment, about the flight attendant's mistake. It was about who she chose to become afterward. The flight attendant was no longer just another face on the plane. She was a leader, a mentor to the newer crew members, someone whose actions now reflected the true spirit of professionalism. A chance meeting. One afternoon, during a layover, she was at the airport cafe, sipping coffee when a familiar face appeared at the door. It was the CEO. She was wearing a simple coat, but there was no mistaking the confident energy she carried with her. The flight attendant stood up immediately. "You've come a long way," the CEO said with a nod, as if she had been watching from a distance the entire time. The flight attendant smiled, though there was a quiet nervousness underneath the calm. "I've been trying." The CEO studied her for a moment. Then, her lips curled into a smile. "Trying isn't enough. You've done it." The flight attendant couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. But she also knew, this wasn't the end. She had taken the first step, but there was still a long journey ahead. The CEO leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper as though sharing a secret. "There's something bigger at play here. You've earned the right to lead. But remember, true leadership isn't about being perfect, it's about learning from every experience and staying humble. A new chapter. As the weeks passed, the flight attendant's influence continued to grow, not only within the airline but also in the eyes of her colleagues and passengers. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She had become someone others looked up to. One day, as she stood at the front of the aircraft, greeting passengers with a warm smile, she saw a familiar face walk down the aisle. The CEO was back, but this time, she didn't need to announce herself. She walked directly to the flight attendant, her eyes meeting hers with that same knowing smile. "I told you that you would prove yourself," the CEO said. "You've done more than that. You've earned a place here, not just as a worker, but as someone who embodies what this company truly stands for." The flight attendant felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just about doing her job right anymore. It was about honoring the lessons she had learned and using them to create a ripple of change. She wasn't just moving up in her career. She was changing the culture around her, one action at a time. The flight attendant stood at the front of the aircraft, her hands steady as she greeted the boarding passengers with a warm smile. The world had changed so much for her in just a few short months. The same woman who had once felt small, invisible in the shadow of her own assumptions, now stood as a leader, respected by her peers and passengers alike. But it wasn't just the respect she had gained. It was the journey, the deep transformation that had come from one decision. One decision to stay and learn, rather than to run away. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the flight attendant found herself reflecting on everything she had learned. How had she gone from being a person who judged others based on their appearance to someone who now believed in empowering and respecting everyone, regardless of their background? The CEO's words echoed in her mind: "People aren't defined by what others think of them, but by how they treat others, and themselves." Those words had been more than just a lesson in professionalism, they had changed her outlook on life. The real test. It wasn't long before another test came her way. She had been promoted to a supervisory position within the airline, a role that put her in charge of managing the crew and ensuring the smooth running of operations. The responsibility weighed heavily on her. She wasn't just in charge of herself anymore, she was in charge of others. One day, an issue arose during a flight, one that could have escalated into a full-blown conflict. One of the newer flight attendants was struggling to manage a particularly difficult passenger, someone who was being rude and disrespectful, making the entire cabin uncomfortable. The flight attendant saw the situation unfold, and something in her shifted. She could have easily dismissed the other flight attendant's efforts and stepped in to handle the situation herself. She could have exercised her newfound authority and asserted control. But instead, she remembered her lessons, the ones she had learned from that woman in first class, the one who had taught her that true leadership was about empowering others. Instead of intervening right away, she walked calmly over to the other flight attendant, her voice low and steady. "You've got this," she said, her words full of encouragement. The younger flight attendant hesitated but then nodded, taking a deep breath. She stepped forward, handling the situation herself, remaining calm, professional, and firm. And within moments, the rude passenger backed down. The flight attendant smiled to herself. The situation had been diffused, not through authority, but through trust and support. A life changed forever. As the years passed, the flight attendant continued to climb the ranks within the airline. She never forgot the CEO's lesson. She never forgot how she had been given a chance, a second chance, and how it had shaped her into the person she was today. It wasn't just about being successful at work anymore. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about creating a positive impact, not just on the people she worked with, but on the world around her. One afternoon, she was standing at the window of her office, looking out at the runway. She could see planes taking off, each one carrying a story, a journey of its own. She had her own journey now. And it wasn't just defined by the title on her office door. It was about how she treated others. About how she respected every person she met, regardless of their status. It was about how she lived her life with integrity and empathy. She had finally come to understand that true power wasn't in titles or in control. True power was in the ability to choose to be better, to choose to be kinder, to choose to grow. And that was the lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The final word. The phone rang. She picked it up, and on the other end, she heard a familiar voice. "I just wanted to say congratulations," the CEO said with a smile in her voice. "I've been watching you. You've made us proud." The flight attendant smiled, a quiet warmth filling her chest. "Thank you. But I couldn't have done it without you." The CEO chuckled softly. "No, you did it yourself. I only showed you the way." And with that, the flight attendant knew that her story wasn't just about a mistake and a second chance. It was about how she chose to rise from the ashes of her past and become the leader she had always had the potential to be. The end, but really, the beginning of something even greater. Life lesson. People aren't defined by what others think of them, but by how they treat others, and themselves. In life, we all face moments when we make mistakes, when we fall short of expectations. But it's in those moments that we have the opportunity to become better, to learn, to grow. Never underestimate the power of choosing to rise above, to treat others with respect, and to remain humble no matter where life takes you.